Burnout 3, Burnout Legends, and Burnout Revenge had some of the most iconic licensed soundtracks in the history of video games. I got into so many bands from those games, including Reggie and the Full Effect, Yellowcard, Motion City Soundtrack, The Starting Line, Unwritten Law, Pennywise, and I mean, the list goes on and on. I can remember hearing about Burnout Paradise back when it was announced in 2007, and that it was coming to the Xbox 360, and this game and Halo 3 were the games that made me realize my original Xbox just wasn't cutting it anymore. And so I finally got an Xbox 360 towards the end of August 2007, and the first game I got was Skate. And then I also got my hands on Halo 3 and Mass Effect when they came out, but those were really the only 3 games I had until Burnout Paradise came out in January of 2008. I'm not sure if Spotify even existed back then, but if it did, I had never heard of it. So the way that I would usually discover new music at the time was through video games. And by this point, the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series was not what it once was. And the last SSX game that had come out didn't even have a licensed soundtrack. It was all just composed by Junkie XL, who at the time was pumping out video game soundtracks like crazy. So when I finally got my hands on Burnout Paradise, I was beyond excited to not only play the game, but also to sink my teeth into the soundtrack and discover new bands to really dive into, until I actually booted it up. I'm sure there are people out there who view this game as having the best soundtrack in the series, but for me it was really disappointing. There were some great bands like Jimmy Eat World, Sugarcult, and Swerve Driver, but for every band I really enjoyed, it seemed like there were 3 more that were just not for me. Guns N' Roses, Avril Lavigne, Alice in Chains, Depeche Mode, that just wasn't what I was looking for in a Burnout game. Years later, I started playing the remaster on Switch, and while the game is still a blast, I still just can't get over how boring I think it sounds compared to Burnout 3 or Burnout Revenge. So I started imagining what kind of soundtrack I would have been really excited by, and I kind of just put one together. I knew I didn't want to put just a whole bunch of huge bands on the list, because part of the fun for me when playing these games was discovering music I had never heard before. So I decided to give myself a budget of 250,000 monthly listeners, and every time I added a song to the soundtrack, I would subtract however many monthly listeners that band had from the budget, rounding to the nearest 1,000. So I couldn't just add 10,000 songs from bands with 25 monthly listeners. Also remember, monthly listeners do change all the time, so by the time you see this, the numbers may have changed. Other than that, I didn't restrict myself at all, so I didn't stop myself from putting more recent bands on the list. Obviously, if I actually played all these songs in the video, I would get a copyright strike and this video would be pulled down. So what you're hearing in the video is my own music, but I have compiled the list into a Spotify playlist and linked that down in the description. So make sure to check that out when you're done with the video. Or you could even pause the video and listen to the songs as they are each listed, however you want to enjoy the music. Definitely let me know what bands you would want to hear on a Burnout soundtrack in the comments as well. If you enjoyed the soundtracks of the classic Burnout games, you're definitely going to find some gems here, so let's get started. Kicking things off, I actually have 2 songs from a band called Eternal Boy, Clean Slate and Growing Pains. They're very obviously meant to be listened back to back, so it felt like I needed both, and I think this would be such a killer opening for the game. 5,000 monthly listeners times 2 brings us to 10,000 and our first 2 songs. After that, we have Sputter by Kali Masi. This is a band I don't really know much about, but they've consistently been one of my most listened to bands since I stumbled into them 5 or 6 years ago on Spotify, and this song absolutely rips. It's perfect for Burnout Paradise. Another 3,000 monthly listeners brings us to 13,000. Up next, we have Alchemy by Banner Pilot, eating up a huge chunk of our budget with 65,000 listeners, but I mean, this song just sounds like Burnout. It definitely needs to be on the soundtrack. That gets us to 78,000. After Banner Pilot, we're going to go with Sorry by You Vandal. I remember playing with this band in Sanford, Florida on a Sunday at like 1 in the afternoon at the Stranded Sailor Pub, probably sometime in 2018. Absolutely loved that place. Honestly, I've had this song stuck in my head ever since. We're going to round them up to 1,000 monthly listeners, and that brings us up to 79,000. Then we're going to stick with another Florida band and go with Average by Rehasher. This is actually the side project of Roger from Less Than Jake, so if you like Less Than Jake but haven't heard Rehasher, you really need to check them out. I caught them at the Stranded Sailor too, and man, what an awesome show seeing them in a room that tiny. Another 10,000 makes 89,000 monthly listeners. After that, we have Kasi Infinity by The Caroline. Or maybe The Caroline, I'm honestly not sure. This is another one of those bands that I really don't know much about, but I've been listening to for a few years thanks to the Spotify algorithm, and this song rules. Another 7,000 brings us to 96,000 listeners. Next is Head Full of Bees by Racket Club. This song was recommended to me back when it first came out by my friend Dave, and it sent me down a massive rabbit hole discovering a ton of connected bands that were all absolutely incredible that I'd missed, like Sam I Am, The Jealous Sound, Knapsack, and eventually Ways Away. Thanks, Dave. All those bands are awesome. This song needs to be here, and it barely even cuts into the budget at 2,000 listeners, which brings us up to 98,000. Up next, Flashlight by Punchline. This is another song that just sounds like Burnout to me and would have fit perfectly on the Burnout Revenge soundtrack, so on our Paradise soundtrack it goes. At 15,000 monthly listeners, that brings us up to 113,000. Shameless self-plug. Next we have The Doc Says Most of My Injuries Are Emotional by Dorian Creech is Dead. And you're actually listening to it right now. Rounding up, that gets us to 114,000. Heading back to Florida for a moment, we have Ode to Father by Whole Wheat Bread. These guys are Florida legends, and I knew I wanted them on the soundtrack. Originally, I was going to use their song Broke, but the opening riff in Ode to Father just sounded like it belonged in a Burnout game, so on the soundtrack it goes. 5,000 listeners later, we're at 119,000. Then we're going to go with RPFO by Debt Neglector. I remember the first time I encountered these guys was at Will's Pub in Orlando, and we were also playing with Pears. If I'm remembering correctly, Pears' vocalist had completely blown his vocal cords the night before and couldn't even talk. So Mora from the band Mixtapes sang for their set. Anyway, Debt Neglector rules, and so does this song. Another 1,000 down, and we're up to 120,000. After that, we have Nintendo 89 by Audio Karate. I'm honestly shocked this band only has about 7,000 monthly listeners. I always thought they were bigger than that, and they definitely deserve to be. We're at 127,000. Up next, Be All That You Can't Be by Broadway Calls. This was one of those bands that I'm kind of surprised they weren't already on a Burnout soundtrack. They fit the sound perfectly, and they're from that era. Turns out they are actually on the soundtrack of a Superbike game from that era, but not this song. 6,000 more monthly listeners brings us to 133,000. Next we have Shame by The Full Blast. I remember the first time I heard this band and just being absolutely blown away. I looked them up at the time, and the only thing I could find out about them was that they shared members with a Wilhelm scream. And then I was like, oh, duh, that makes sense. Of course they're incredible. Also, if you like this band, check out Precursor. They're absolutely amazing as well. 3,000 listeners, and now we are at 136,000. That brings us to Panic, Panic, Panic by Joker's Republic. I played a show with these guys at Flint Hard Cider up here in Michigan, and honestly, I don't think I've ever been more impressed by a three-piece band. Like, ever. They are one of the best live bands I've ever seen, and they definitely fit on this soundtrack. Another 6,000 listeners gets us to 142,000. After Joker's Republic, we're going with Ire by the Dopamines. This band absolutely embodies that 2000s punk sound that I associate with Burnout 3 and Revenge. They have to be on the soundtrack. 9,000 more listeners, and we're up to 151,000. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to subscribe because I'll definitely be doing more of these reimagined soundtrack videos in the future. Next, we're going to burn a pretty big chunk of our budget on Prisoner Echoes by Strike Anywhere. This band was on a number of Tony Hawk soundtracks, including the first Underground game, but this is my favorite song by them, and it hasn't been in any games to my knowledge. It definitely fits the vibe I'm going for with this soundtrack. That's another 60,000 listeners and brings us to 201,000. After Strike Anywhere, we're on to Once Was I by Implants. I remember the first time I ever heard this song, I was actually out for a walk, and the song came on Spotify, and the second I heard the guitar, I was like, is this a new Strung Out song? This sounds like Strung Out. And then the vocals came in, and it obviously was a different band, so I looked them up, and Rob Ramos from Strung Out is in this band. I actually really wanted to put Strung Out on this list, as they are one of my all-time favorites, but they would have taken up far too much of the listener budget, so this is a great substitute. 6,000 more listeners, and we're up to 207,000. Up next, Strikes and Gutters, Ups and Downs by Kid You Not. I didn't know these guys super well, but they actually were one of the first bands I ever met in the Florida scene. I actually saw them one of the first times I would ever go to Uncle Lou's Entertainment Hall, which, honestly, I still can't believe is gone. They split up a few years ago, and it's probably for good, unfortunately, as their guitarist Ben sadly passed away last year, but man, I wish I could see them again. Rounded up to another 1,000, and we are up to 208,000. Then we have Talk About by Goalkeeper. I don't actually know anything about this band really, but this song keeps getting stuck in my head, and I think it fits on this soundtrack, so on the soundtrack it goes. That's another 19,000, and we are up to 227,000. Next we have So Let's Go Nowhere by the Arrogant Sons of Bitches. This is another band that I think kind of embodies that 2000s punk sound, but then make it ska and add just the right amount of zaniness. Jeff Rosenstock was in this band before Bomb the Music Industry. This song is killer, 21,000 monthly listeners, and we are up to 248,000. After that, we have Le Grand Fromage by Rebuilder. This is another band that I don't really know much about, but I absolutely love this song. 2,000 more listeners, so that brings us up to our total target of 250,000. That's it. That's the soundtrack. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and include a link to a Spotify playlist of these songs in the video description, so be sure to check that out, and also be sure to let me know what games you would like to see a reimagined soundtrack for in the future. Catch you next time.